Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you so much for coming to our Food Policy for Breakfast seminar series. I want to welcome you to Hunter College here in East Harlem. And my name is Charles Platkin, and I'm the director of the Food Policy Center and a nutrition professor here at Hunter College. We're excited to welcome you here today. We debated back and forth about whether or not to cancel today's event. And it was not an easy decision, as you probably would understand why. And we respect those who decided not to come and those who decided to join. We are videotaping this, so it will be available on our YouTube channel so everybody can watch it. And certainly we thank our guests and panelists and experts for coming, knowing and considering what's going on in the city of New York and the state of New York and the country and the world. And we really, are conscientious and care and pray and hope that everybody gets better and that this is reduced in a public health sophisticated way. One thing I could tell you is what we have done here is we sprayed every seat with some form of Lysol, okay, so you could feel somewhat comfortable. And we also had people that work in our office wipe it down with sanitizer, so we did a double. Okay, just to be extra safe. And you notice that I put a Purell right there, so when you walk in you can't miss it. Try to use it on the exit. It's free, and I think it's important, especially as we touch our faces and we practice good sanitary and good hygiene. I think that's important. We're fortunate to have four experts to join us and discuss the impact of food on education. Dr. Kara Cute from Rutgers University, Dr. Andrea Dearline from NYU School of Global Public Health, Dr. Kevin Frohner, principal of Manhattan Hunter High School, and Dr. Amy Schwartz from Syracuse University, who joins us via Skype, which we're really excited about because it's our first time, and we have a double image of her, she's omnipresent. So what I'd like to do is if you could start, Kevin, and just sort of give us a 1 minute on your connection to food's impact on education, and introduce yourself if you don't mind.
Sure. So good morning, Kevin Frohner, principal of Hunter Science High School, and I am the director of a fellowship called the Gray Fellowship for Principal Excellence, where we work with principals to transform New York City public elementary and high schools. God, tough to do this in a minute. I guess it was about 6 years ago we were looking at making significant changes to the school, really thinking through what transformative change looked and felt like. And we really got through some pretty extraordinary challenges the first few years. This is of my principalship. Mostly academic, some changes to the physical space, but then we got to cafeteria food. And that was the hurdle we couldn't seem to climb. We were sitting there thinking of a range of options. That's a strange sound. Is that coming from?
It's reconnecting.
Yeah, it's reconnecting. All right, it's buffering. So, there we were looking at the cafeteria food, thinking like, okay, well, I don't think we have any good solutions. And then threw out the crazy idea: what if we just simply grow our own food? And we meant it. I mean, I think it was like the best option that we actually had. And we began this process of looking into how to grow our own food. And at one point we had a proposal to basically build a massive greenhouse on the front terrace of 65th in Amsterdam, which is where we're located. We're co-located in a building with 6 schools. It's called the Martin Luther King campus. And we pitched this, extraordinary project, which was shot down. It was way too expensive. And then someone introduced hydroponic farming to me. And then I realized I could put it anywhere. And we found these storage closets in the cafeteria that had probably 20 to 30 years of just accumulated junk, old desks, tables. And it's amazing how attached people are to their junk. You know, there are all these reality shows about things like this, but then the principals, they didn't want to let go of their old desks, so that took like a few months, but finally they agreed, and we cleared out these rooms and we built a hydroponic farm that is projected this year to grow 15,000 pounds of food. And we're doing it at about $50, maybe less, per month. So for $50 a month, we're growing 15,000 pounds of produce, and this has already begun. So our food is now in the cafeteria, it's mixed in our salad bar, and my hope is to eventually introduce some rice and beans and get a little closer to like a Chipotle bowl or something like that. All right, I think that's more than a minute, so I'll yield to my colleague.
Hi, my name is Andrea Dearline. I'm an assistant professor in public health nutrition at the School of Global Public Health at NYU. So my background, I'm a trained nutritional epidemiologist, and most of my work has focused on pregnancy, nutrition during pregnancy, as well as with infants and children, and I also teach maternal and child nutrition. I've done some work with breakfast in the classroom during my postdoc years, as well as looking at food insecurity among the NYU students and looking at different menus from private and public schools. So I've done a decent amount of work looking at child nutrition.
Hi, I'm Kara Cute from the Department of Human Ecology at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. I am a research psychologist by training, and most of my work falls into two different categories. The first one is the most relevant to this. It's working on issues of food insecurity. Like Andrea, I've been working within Rutgers, within my own university at Rutgers, looking at the prevalence of college student food insecurity and some solutions there. I work closely with the Rutgers Student Food Pantry. Within the community of New Brunswick, I have worked with the public schools doing an evaluation of their breakfast after the bell. I also do work on risk communication, specifically risk communication around food. So I've looked at public perceptions of genetically modified and genetically engineered foods and the new labels that we should all be seeing on our foods coming out over the next couple of years, as well as foodborne illness and food recalls and how to communicate with the public about those issues.
Amy?
I'm Amy Schwartz. I'm an economist by training, now at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University, but at NYU for many years at the Wagner School, where I'm now the youngest emeritus professor. I come to doing work on food really from an interest in education and education outcomes, and have done work on New York City public schools, ed policy, school spending, different sorts of things, trying to understand what determines academic outcomes. Why do some succeed and others don't? And kind of came into this understanding like that hunger matters and food matters, and sort of started getting interested in some of the interventions that New York City has done. And so I've written a series of papers trying to understand the link between school food policy and the provision of school food and student academic outcomes. This includes work on breakfast in the classroom, the extension of universal free breakfast, and now more recently, universal free meals. I've done work on water jets in schools and impacts on childhood obesity. So it's a range of things that are trying to understand how does what the food that's provided at school affect how kids do. And built a very big and detailed data set of New York City public school students, the schools they go to, their academic outcomes, linking to the food policy in their school, their participation in school lunch, and all sorts of other things, which, and the fitnessgram data, which I really give credit to the New York City Department of Education, the Office of School Food, and the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene in making this possible.
Thank you. So I want to jump right into the topic and ask, generally, what specific impact does food have on academic behavior, attendance, performance, and/or academic and/or attrition? And I think that, what is the clear and convincing evidence? I mean, I think anecdotally, I could say with assurance as a non-expert that, if someone isn't fed well, that their concentration levels aren't going to be as high. And when you talk to people about this topic, generally they go, well, of course, right? I mean, it's obvious. If you don't eat, you're going to not be able to concentrate. So I guess what I'm looking for is, what is some of the evidence and what are some of the anecdotal stories that are out there, both that will sort of convince people that this is something that's critical and important and we need to be paying attention to it. So we can start with whomever.
Well, I don't want to jump in at the wrong spot, so you tell me when it could be my turn.
You're just so much bigger than the other. You have so much more power. You could kind of take over the whole thing if you wanted to.
Who knows if the internet is gonna succeed. So the work that I have been doing has been explicitly focused on trying to understand the impact of policy, intervention at the policy level. And I would draw the distinction between that and the sort of nutrition-based work. And I know there are folks in this panel who can speak much more about that. But what I think has been really compelling about this recent paper that we did is that we showed in, I think, a incredibly causal and convincing way that extending universal free meals to all students in the school improved academic outcomes in both English language arts and mathematics, both for poor kids who would otherwise have been individually eligible for free lunch and for their non-poor counterparts. And we're extending that work now using data from New York State, looking at longer time periods. Other people are starting to look at this with the expansion of the community eligibility provision, which allows districts to adopt this. And it seems like the evidence is coming down pretty clear. Making lunch free for all kids improves academic outcomes. Some evidence it reduces absenteeism, some other positive effects, and this is an important thing, no evidence that it increases obesity. Absolutely none. And we've got big numbers.
So thank you. That was excellent. So Kara, you did work on food insecurity and college students, and I guess it dovetails off of what Amy just talked about. And I wonder, you found that GPA. Can you talk about that and how that relates, and then maybe some of the reasons that you can both speculate as to why, and everybody jump in as to why?
So we at Rutgers did a study in 2016, and we've repeated it, but we don't have the data yet. We did it at the end of 2019. In 2016, we had a large sample, almost 20% of our student body, that included undergraduates and graduates that we were able to survey. And we found among undergraduates a very statistically significant relationship between level of food insecurity and GPA, so that the more food insecure a student was, the lower their GPA was. And we have a graph, and you can see it really, really clearly. And that has been found at pretty much every school that's looked at it, that food insecurity is related to lower GPAs. And what we did at Rutgers that really we haven't seen done in other schools is we looked at our graduate students as well. We had a pretty big sample of graduate students, and we see that, again, it is statistically significantly related to GPA. Now, graduate GPAs tend to be much higher than undergraduate GPAs, and there's a lot less variability for probably because of grade inflation to a certain extent, but also because the students who make it to graduate school are pretty good at school. If you're getting a low GPA, you're not going to end up in graduate school. So I think it's some combination of those factors. So the GPAs across the board are higher, so it's not as dramatic, but the association is there. So in both groups, it's clear that being food insecure is associated with having a lower GPA. And what I would say anecdotally, we've done qualitative research talking to a number of our students, and also Stephanie Brescia, who's a graduate student that I work with, who is defending her dissertation on Friday. Part of her dissertation looked at differences between people who we count as food insecure. So when you look at food insecurity, there's usually, using the USDA definitions, there's 4 levels. And the lowest 2 are considered food insecure, and the highest 2 are considered food secure. So there's a moderate food security group. And she found that even those students that would count as food secure report food worry, and their GPAs look more like the food insecure students. So even though they're counting as food insecure, they're on the lower end of food secure students, and their GPAs start to look more like the food insecure students because they're worrying about food. And our anecdotal evidence from the evidence from our qualitative research, the students talk about being worried and not having to focus on where they're going to get food from rather than being able to study. And that it just seems to take a lot of their cognitive effort and their time to be thinking about food instead of just concentrating on school.
So just to open this up a little bit, so do you think, and let's take off our academic research hats, do you think that it's because of them having to work more hours, the worry part which you brought up, is it also because they're hungry? Are those the 3 factors that we should pay attention to? That they have to work more, that they have to worry more, and that they have less food, which decreases their ability to concentrate. Am I missing something, or?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what you've found in terms of actually being less food. I mean, there's less food, but also just poor quality, nutritional quality food that they're eating. You know, if we're talking anecdotally, I'm a big proponent of physical activity and exercise and sleep. And, you know, the number of times that I talk to my students, I think when we're talking about college-age students, they're going through this transition, right, of suddenly becoming very independent. Specifically for New York City, I've had students tell me that just the transition to moving to New York City is also extraordinarily stressful. So you have all of these different things, I think, going on at the same time. But I also think it's important to focus on just the idea that they're, as well as being hungry, just not even taking in nutritionally adequate food.
Yeah, and I think that that's something we want to get to, is that, you know, which I don't want to deal with right this second, but is feeding versus feeding, not feeding versus feeding crappy food, right? So we'll talk about that. But Kevin, you have high school students and not college students, and just sort of right in between, and some of them are in their 12th grade or going into college at Hunter. What are you finding?
Yeah, and I think I could provide a lot more on the anecdotal side of things because I'm not a researcher. I want to tell you 2 stories. One is a personal story. When I was an undergrad, I left school to go join the Marine Corps. And you hear many things when you're in boot camp. Keep the safety on and things related to that field. But the thing we heard most of all was drink water. And we heard it all day long. Wherever we were, fill your canteen and drink water. And there are very practical reasons for that, especially when you're training. Now, fast forward, first year as principal, kids coming in the office constantly, struggling with headaches and lack of focus, not generally feeling well, and not sure what to do with those feelings, right? So when kids are struggling with health issues, they typically don't have the wherewithal to address those issues. So they surrender to the system, right? It's like they've reached a point where it's like, I don't know what's wrong with me, I'm feeling lightheaded, someone help me. Now, as an adult, the first thing you may think is like, let me eat something, let me drink some water. But kids can go hours. I mean, they could go, kids come in the morning, they don't eat breakfast, they skip lunch, They go 10, 12 hours, who knows when they ate the night before, and they're just not fully present. So we started encouraging kids to simply drink water. So this is pre-hydroponic farm and nutrient-dense, including more nutrient-dense food. And again, anecdotally, I'll turn to my colleagues here if they're familiar with research on this, and you may be familiar with research on this as well, but noticing we noticed a real shift at the time, just in...
Well, just when you say
Yeah.
encourage, could you describe did you put up posters? Did you just tell them to drink more water? Did you have something organized or coordinated?
Yeah, I think it was just a lot of messaging. At that point, I make the rounds often, so we have an advisory program, but talking to kids about eating, making sure they eat at least 2 meals a day while they're with us on campus, and drinking throughout the day. But then we had this issue. This is the second story. So we had this issue that the water fountains, I don't know, you know, Charles, you may be familiar with this, but they have this like green slime trickling down the nozzle. I don't know what that is. I'm sure someone here does. I don't know. Anyone here know what that green slime is? You do.
Calcium buildup.
Yeah.
Calcium buildup?
It's not good.
Yeah, I don't know why it's green. So I wanted to put a water filter station in the main area near the office, and it was a big issue. It was not easy to do. Charles, knows that our struggles with the hydroponic farm trying to put a sink in, and how difficult it can be in the city to put a sink in a space. But a water filter station is also not so easy. It's we're in a big, rather large bureaucracy. So the custodian had some issues with putting it in, and whatever the policies are around installing a water filter station. So I said to him, okay, well, these kids won't drink the water. And he was like, well, it's fine, what's wrong with the water? I said, well, I'd like you to drink some of the water. I said, look, when you were in high school, I'm sure people dared you to do different things. I'm daring you right now. I dare you to drink the water. And he laughed, and I said, it's not a joke. I'm literally daring you. I would like you. I will drink the water. You drink the water. Let's drink this water. And it trickles down, like the water fountains. This happens a lot in New York City schools. Like the water doesn't really make its way up. It doesn't project. It just kind of trickles. So you have to kind of get your mouth right on the water fountain and get some of that green slime in your mouth. And he wouldn't do it. And I said, all right, well, if you won't drink the damn water, then put in the water filter station. And he did. So we put 2 water filter stations in, and then we got all the kids water bottles. I forget who we were working with at the time. Someone was generous enough to donate water bottles. We gave every kid a water bottle. We said, here, take this water bottle, fill up your water bottle every day, and drink water throughout the day. So this is really simple stuff, right? Really, really simple. But then you realize when you're sitting in a classroom with kids as a teacher, or in my position now as principal, that kids do not necessarily take good care of themselves throughout the day, and the system doesn't always take good care of them, so then, by default, no one's taking care of them. So something simple as water, just giving a kid a water bottle and giving them access to clean, filtered water makes a huge difference, at least in my experience, anecdotally, but I'm curious if, what the research says in some things, so I assume there's been a ton of research on hydration and focus, and how important it is to keep kids hydrated throughout a day.
I
So
don't
I'd
know
like to add this one thing. We did a study a few years back on the impact of adding these water jets, the filtered water. We saw reductions in childhood obesity in the schools that had those adopted. And because they were adopted, following stories like yours, we really weren't worried very much that there was a problem in a causal interpretation. So we're able to say because nobody was putting them in place for childhood obesity. And then, really incredible. And water matters.
No, I was just going to go back to your original question, and I would say that the evidence is there. There's a lot of evidence to show that, even from cross-sectional studies, but then when they do longitudinal studies where they look over the course of a school year, and the impact of having any sort of breakfast program or food program seems to increase, levels of either math or reading scores or attention and things like that. So there is definitely evidence, and it comes from both sources of studies. So people can't just say it's cross-sectional, and when they try to adjust for the numerous factors that you would think of in terms of socioeconomic status, other disparities, maternal depression, housing issues, et cetera, they still seem to see an effect of having school meals on academic performance.
So, I shake my head when I hear that, because I think, well, this is so obvious, because, test scores are so important, to administrators. I mean, they seem to be everything. I'm sorry, Kevin, but it seems that that's the way it is. It's not above your,
Other
other than you. And this seems like such an obvious something, right? Increase, if you went and I tried to get a meeting with the top administrators in New York City, and I said, I can guarantee that I'm going to improve, scores by X percent. And I'm going to guarantee you, I'm going to increase graduation rates. And I'm going to guarantee, and I'll guarantee it, if you do everything I say. I'll get a meeting probably. But what I don't understand is, why isn't more attention? And why is it such a slog? Unless I'm wrong, maybe it's not a slog. Maybe we are making this incredibly progress, and I should be corrected. Should I be corrected? Are we making incredible progress in city school systems or school systems across the country that would be considered maverick? Kevin?
Yeah, I think you're wrong.
Yeah, good.
Across the country, universal free meals is just taken off, right? I mean, right, isn't it? Under the community eligibility provision, universal free meals is spreading rapidly across New York State. Lots of places are doing it. And I think the problem is with your guarantee is you're not putting up any money, right? These things cost money, right? Cost a lot, and the question that people have, and they don't actually know yet, is how much money. People worry about the unintended consequences for obesity. I think that's why.
And what about the quality of the meals? Because we're talking about feeding versus quality too. That's also critical.
I don't know, my sense, maybe I'm just hanging in a weird crowd, but there's a lot of talk about how to make this better. Scratch cooking, trying to improve those things. When I do my road show that shows, about universal free meals, somebody invariably says, well, isn't the meal that I'm sending my kid from home better? And I typically say, yeah, maybe, or six. And then I put up a picture of a Lunchable, right?
Yeah, so I think that in theory, the talk seems strong. Scratch cooking, a lot of that is New York City. I'm not seeing that all across the country. I'm seeing that in some urban and, high sophisticated urban places.
Yeah.
But Kevin, just tried to put this hydroponic, garden in, which was not some maverick, crazy idea in the cafeteria, and it took almost 6 years, right?
Just about, yeah.
So I think that there's a lot of thinking around these issues that are positive that you may be finding, Amy, but I'm not so sure that they're being implemented or it's a slow process. And then when you have changes in administration, it gets completely derailed on a national level, or changes locally, right? Because it is they're very politically charged, right? Of who should take care of what and who should serve what, and should the dairy industry be involved, and should the meat industry be involved, and what roles they play, and it becomes a real political hotbed. Again, I'm just trying to.
Yeah, let me respond to some of that. I think you're pointing to 3 separate issues. One is the quality of food. 2 is the quantity of food. And I think I agree wholeheartedly that having universal free lunch programs and breakfast has made a huge difference in the city schools. But then there's the third, which is the experience that students are having within school communities, where the focus is very much on test scores and things of that nature. So it becomes a very dehumanizing process. There's not a lot of attention on student care. We don't really focus so much on that. I don't know how in tuned schools are to their cafeterias, right? It's like this separate entity that exists on campus, and it's a place that I think most people avoid I don't know how much time teachers, for instance, spend in a cafeteria. Probably no time at all unless they're assigned there for a lunch duty, which is a very unpopular place to be throughout the day. They'd much rather be in their classrooms preparing lessons or grading or something like that. So, so do we think about the quality of our food by extension, right? Of having schools be more humanizing spaces. I don't find that very often. And it doesn't mean that educators are not, that educators don't care deeply about their students, but do we see students as whole people when they enter the building? I mean, I remember one of the first thoughts I had about being a school principal when I was transitioning from being a teacher at that same school. My guiding mantra was, what would I want for my own kids? And it helped a lot. It helped with, you know, me even looking in the bathrooms, making sure that, you know, we had toilet paper in the bathrooms and we had locks on the stalls. But you can walk into a city school and like, there are no doors on the, on the stalls. So we miss a lot of small things, like what I shared earlier about these water fountains, and I think we do so because we don't include children in this process called public education as whole people, and we miss a lot.
So, yeah, so coming off of that for a second, I think there's a lot of issues, right? So just simply giving meals is not, you're only gonna take it so far in terms of improving without improving all of these other things outside of that. But I will say that from the research, it looks like providing so when you're getting at quality versus anything, it looks like there's some improvement just from giving anything. And then from that, if you were to improve the quality and the variety, right? So having a breakfast or a meal that has dairy, that has whole grains in it, that has a fruit or a vegetable, giving more variety and improving that quality also seems to go the step above, giving anything. Because if you want to talk about biological processes, some of it is your brain runs on glucose, right? So if you are, if you sleep overnight and that's your overnight fast, and then you don't ever break your fast, with breakfast, then you have in the immediate sense, you don't have enough glucose, and your brain runs on glucose. So that's why we think about people being tired, fatigued, having low attention, not having good reaction times in terms of test taking and things like that. So just even having something to eat improves your glucose levels, and then if you improve the quality beyond that, so you have lower glycemic index foods that then sort of keep the blood glucose at a steady level longer, right? Then you also see improved quality from getting from breakfast, or improved performance from getting from breakfast to then lunch, when then you would replenish those nutrients. So there's the immediate things, and then there's also just long-term chronic, not have anemia, right? Having iron deficiency and other micronutrient deficiencies that come from long-term chronic malnutrition.
And I would add, just in New Brunswick, we were seeing when we first introduced the breakfast program, breakfast participation rates skyrocketed. They went really way up, and it was a universal breakfast program in the classroom after the bell. And over time, those numbers started to really come down, and it had a lot to do with what the students perceived as the quality of the food. So it was meeting all of the regulations, but the students didn't like the food very much, and they were saying things like they were getting whole grain muffins, but we did a focus group, and one of the students told me it comes up to the classroom frozen. He said, I hit it on the desk, it was like a rock hitting the desk because it wasn't properly defrosted. And so I think getting the students' feedback, as was mentioned, and having the students really be a part of the decision making and figuring out what is the food that they want to eat and what is quality to them, and issues with the taste of the food and cultural appropriateness of the food, and all of those things I think play a role, so that you can provide the food, but you also want to make sure that the students are eating it and eating all of it and the components of the meal that you want them to be eating.
So Amy, again, not to beat this, but I still wish there was something more coordinated, right?
Yeah, so let me just say a couple of things that struck me about this. Sometimes I describe the work that I do as trying to, I'm looking at the other stuff in education. right? So actually I'm doing some work on housing and kids' educational outcomes and transportation and but the vast majority of people doing work on schools and education, school policy, and most of that energy really goes into the classroom, trying to understand how to build a better teacher, bigger classes, smaller classes, different curriculum, better curriculum, all of that, right? That is where this is what educators do, right? They get up in the morning and this is mostly what they think about. So it's, I think, important to put in perspective that it's not that the food nutrition aspect is uniquely ignored. Right? I want to say a lot of things about this are all just second, because what's primary is what goes on in the classroom. And I'm often arguing that these are the other things that make it easier to teach, make it easier for kids to learn, but it's the same battle in many things. So it's, I think, important to put in perspective that this is partially why. It's also partially that some of these things that we talk about and the evidence about it is evidence from individuals. It's from sort of small sample studies in a sense of trying to understand how food affects how individuals do, which is different than a policy level. Right? And so I think that's what some of this frustration is. We can move policy levers, we can move practice levers, but it's a different thing. And I think the evidence base is thinner than it seems. I mean, it's like we all know if we don't eat, we're not going to do well. That's not to say that if we try to feed a bunch of kids, they're all going to do better on the standardized tests, which are not that sensitive. So.
And that may be also, so I have two things to say to that, which is that maybe there needs to be, maybe because food, housing, and all of those things, they may seem secondary, but they can be more consistent than potentially the teacher or the classroom.
I'm with you.
The other question is, which dovetails right off of what and happens to be on my list, which is a good thing, is where do you see some of the major gaps in research examining the impact of food on academic performance and behavior and attendance, and how do we get it from being, quote unquote, thin and to be more substantial and be taken even, more serious as if this is the end all be all? I'll open that up to everybody, but Amy, I'm sure you have something to say on that.
Well, I'll just say a little bit, and then I'll come back if it seems that. I mean, so one of the things is we just need a whole bunch of other studies on it, and they have to be causal studies. So I think an association is interesting. It makes us think, wow, we ought to go look at that. But what's going to carry the day, at least in my experience, what's going to influence policymakers is we need quasi-experimental or experimental studies in lots of different settings, trying different things, looking at the long term. So all the things I've just discussed, these are relatively recent. And some of this is possible because New York City was incredibly generous and gave us detailed data on who participates in school lunch and who doesn't. But the vast majority, I don't know anybody else who has it in the whole country. So some of, we need to do a lot more of this. We need to see, how does this play out in the long run? How does it play out in high school? So those would be sort of my big pitches.
I would agree with that on the college level as well, that we see a lot of associations between food insecurity and GPA, and there aren't a lot of there's not a lot of evidence that we can change that in a convincing way. The experimental or quasi-experimental evidence so we at Rutgers are just now starting a fund for food, like a food plan scholarship fund, and we have some money, and we're talking now about, can we sort of randomly assign people to get it or to not get it, if we can get a slice of the student body who are food insecure, and then try to do some kind of quasi-experiment where we can say, oh, well, if we give people a meal, if we have a group of food insecure students, we give some of them a meal plan, we can see those differences that the meal plan will make. It's very hard to do, in part because we don't have enough money to have enough students in the study to make it a meaningful study. It's very expensive. Other schools are doing it, but again, they have 20 or 30 students. It's hard to do. University of Houston did a food scholarship, so not a meal plan scholarship, but a food scholarship where they randomly assigned students to receive it or to not receive it. They were actually giving them food as opposed to the meal plan, and a lot of the students didn't end up taking them up on it because it was difficult to get the food at school and bring it home, and there were challenges. So what I would love to see is sort of a hybrid of that I think might be more cost effective, which is like a grocery store gift card scholarship, or something that it's not as expensive as a meal plan, but it's not as cumbersome as having the actual food at the school that you have to bring home, and to see if that makes a difference. And that would be something that I think would be convincing if we could, and I think it would show a difference. And I think we're moving in that direction, but it just hasn't been done yet.
Andrea?
I don't know if I have, is the question more just what type of research we need to?
What are we missing? What are we missing in order to be able to create a more substantial and significant case that it's not ad hoc and not us just, as public health professionals and people that care about education saying, hey, you gotta have better food and we need it and our students are gonna do better and here's a study. Something, more substantial, I think, to be able to be, clear and convincing to the administration to make sure that the budgets, match what we think we should be having and what we know anecdotally, but we can't necessarily show through research. If we all agree that that's the problem, if we agree that, hey, we need to have much better evidence. I mean, we were at a meeting, the deputy director and I, with the Aspen Institute, talking about sugar tax and so forth, and the person from Robert Wood Johnson came up to us and said, there's one study that shows that sugar sweetened beverages negatively impact students. So you're not going to get any funding from us. So
I know, yeah. I mean, I find this all. I mean, say this very quickly. I just find a lot of this difficult because, first of all, on the population level, even if you see small increases in academic importance or academic achievement, I still think that's very important, right? On the population level of having even these small increases, because when we think about cyclical things of, growing up and not having the educational achievement, and then that results in, lower incomes and, kind of continuing this cycle. The other thing too is I work with a lot of obesity, and that's one of the other problems that we always have with these, when you try to do these large policy changes and then they'll say, okay, but did it impact obesity? And then you see these tiny little BMI changes and then nobody wants to support it because they say, it didn't have any impact on, changing people's weights. But maybe it had an impact on changing people's, nutritional status. Maybe they started eating better quality foods. Maybe they, maybe it made these smaller changes or other changes that were not necessarily, we're always looking for these, significant, huge measurements, and maybe it's not that, so.
Yeah, I'm wondering, for parents in the room, how many of you, over maybe the last few weeks or maybe months, wondered how feeding your child dinner might improve their test scores? And maybe you wondered further and said, well, I'm not really seeing a correlation here, so maybe we can save some money by not giving you dinner. And I mean, it's a silly...
I think the really, an important thing here is for us to also just remember that these things are competing on a budget constraint. So I wrote a paper last year looking at what happens when at the end of the SNAP cycle, right? So what's the other big food program? It's SNAP. So we looked at whether kids are more likely to take up lunch at the end of the SNAP month, and it turns out that they do, that to some extent, especially among the high school students, there's they'd rather eat their lunch out. And as I was giving the talk, afterwards, somebody came over to me and said, there's a big move to reduce SNAP and just expand school lunch and school breakfast, because we know that way hungry kids have something to eat, but you can't really trust parents with SNAP. I thought, Well, that is really not what I was thinking of when I got into this, into doing this work. I was just warned, and I think that we have to be mindful, is that there's this other program, there's SNAP. We don't want to be competing with that, or we don't want to be taken, maybe you do, but away from that. And also, as we think about, if not, we think about it in the school food budget, we don't want to be competing with, special education, with classroom, where there's a budget reality we got to be mindful of. I mean, how would we feel if not so much SNAP? Not so good.
So there was a point to that joke, and I think it's the point to it is that I'm trying to make here is that the paradigm that we're in right now is problematic, right? For you, I think Charles earlier you suggested that looking at these outside factors is secondary, right? Well, that's a problem, right? I mean, it's a problem that these outside factors like housing or food and nutrition, those are secondary. So trying to tie everything to test scores or student achievement, that notion itself, I think, is problematic, right? Like, to push for more research, right, to try to find this correlation is inherently, I think, in some ways unethical, right? Like, we need to, compete, the mention of, school budgets, like that we would even put these two things side by side, special education services and, let's say, breakfast, right? So we really do need a shift, I think, holistically within the system, New York City and presumably other cities like New York. How are we taking good care of our children? What do they need? Because I'm sure the research, there's a myriad research on what happens outside of the school system, right? What happens when children only eat 1 meal a day or 2 meals a day? What happens when children don't have simply enough calories? We're just talking about caloric intake. What happens to those children? What happens to their levels of concentration, the ability to focus, right? School is tough. You're sitting in a classroom for 43 minutes, a bell rings, right? In this very Pavlovian way, you jump up, you run to another classroom where you sit again for 43 minutes, and then the bell rings, and then you jump to another classroom where you sit for 43 minutes, and this is your, mainly your exercise. I mean, I don't want to get into the quality of physical education and school systems, but like you're just standing, sitting for a long period of time, and then doing it again, and then you're being inundated with new information, right? And that there's a lot of it, and you're told, well, it's important information because it'll be on some test at the end of the year, and if you don't pass it, you may not move on to the next grade level, and I may lose my job because your test scores are tied to my teacher evaluation. So where are the humanizing elements and all this? I think the research on this is probably overwhelming. What happens when you actually care for children? It's just not part of the current paradigm, right? The overwhelming focus in this paradigm is student test scores, and it's interesting how we bring it even to this conversation, right? It's hard for us not to, right? Because we're in it. We're also in the paradigm. So then we wonder, okay, how can we prove that, this improves test scores?
Right, but aren't we trying to figure a way to work within the structure that's been set up, right? So if someone's interested in, like it's basic sales, if someone's interested in, getting higher test scores, you want to figure out what you could sell them that, that's going to get them higher test scores, right? I mean, that's just the way my mind works, right? So if I could sell them that universal free lunch is going to get them higher test scores, that's what, because I know that it's better for the students holistically and they're going to have a better life, I'm going to push that button, right? That's how I'm wired. So, I guess you're right in the system. You're living and breathing it every day. What do they care about? How do we, as researchers and scientists and public health advocates and policymakers, try to influence that system that you know intricately well?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's always been about changing the conversation, right? Like, I can't imagine someone getting up there, an elected official or an appointed bureaucrat, making the case that, that we need to, or someone from the outside needs to prove to us that this, let's say we're talking about nutrition, right? Or universal, providing universal free lunch. I think people in elected positions or appointed positions, they have a responsibility, and I think as we change the narrative, And I think it's important, and it's hard work to change a narrative, right? You know, we have a president who's like very good at changing the narrative and controlling a narrative, but he's also, by default, reminded us all of how powerful it can be when you can take hold of a narrative. And from what I see in the system is that, you know, like this narrative around test scores and achievement, it's unethical, and it's to some extent it can be quite cruel, right, to the students that we're serving. And I don't know how we do it. How do we change the narrative? I mean, it's where politics meets policy. But we do need a shift here, a major, major shift within the system that you'd even have to feel, like that you'd walk in a meeting and feel like you have to make a pitch for this I mean, it's in many ways it's just quite sad that we're in this state where that you feel like that you'd have to convince someone and have the research to show, you know, that, you know, the significance of providing nutritional meals to our children.
Yeah, but think about it. You have budgetary restraints, right? You have teachers wanting higher salaries. You have buildings that are falling apart. You have to make decisions, you know, from an administrative point of view, of where you're going to allocate resources, right? So when you're looking at allocating resources and you're looking at when you get those resources, aren't resources given because of test scores? And again, I don't know the system that well, but isn't that part of it? Like your budgets and how the state allocates, and I would assume that that's part of it. And, you know, attendance and things like that. So I think by showing these things to the administration, to the city council, and being able to demonstrate in a clear and convincing way that, hey, we're gonna get you more money, you know, so that you could build better schools by having, you know, by everybody getting free lunch. There's gonna be better test scores in New York City, and therefore we're gonna get a bigger, and there'll be higher attendance, and we're gonna get a better allocation of the budget. I mean, I know it sounds horrible, right?
No, it doesn't sound horrible. I mean, here's the thing. I think it's important for us to distinguish between educators and health departments and mayors, and, you know, different groups have different responsibilities. And I think the schools have often pushed back when being tasked with taking responsibility for everything, right? So you could make the same argument about healthcare. And in fact, we have a growing number of school-based health centers. You know, because you could make just a similar case about many things, and, you know, I think you're right. It competes in the budget, and schools were not primarily built to feed children. So I'm not saying they shouldn't, but they are charged with educating them. Now, where do I think there's big movement? I don't think it's all about test scores. The recent reauthorization of ESSA included measures of absenteeism and chronic absenteeism among them. Graduation rate matters. It is not the only one. So, you know, I think pushing in that direction is a really important thing. But this concern that comes from the education world is, I think, legitimate. They can't be held responsible for all things for children. They need partners. And that's that's federalism. I mean, that's the way we organize government.
Let me just make one more point on this topic. This week, there's been a lot of rhetoric about keeping schools open, right? So what did they say about keeping schools open? How many politicians or, you know, appointed officials, a chancellor, the UFT president Mike Mulgrew, the mayor de Blasio, how many of them talked about student achievement? How many of them talked about test scores? How many of them talked about curriculum? Not a single person. What did they say over and over again? We have 750,000 students living at or below the poverty line. We feed them 2 to 3 meals a day. Over and over and over again. That is what they're saying. We feed them 2 to 3 meals a day. That's why we must be open. I would suggest then, maybe by some accounts, that is the most important thing we do to some extent in our school system, right, is that we care for children. We provide free daycare for parents, we provide food, we provide social emotional support, right? Those are the big ones. So when we sit and put together a budget, maybe we begin with the social emotional well-being of our children, the safety of our children, and by extension, the nutrition that our children receive daily in our schools, because that is the reality of schooling today.
Kevin Forner for Chancellor. Okay, I want to open it up for audience questions, and I will use a wipe when I hand you the microphone.
Hi, I'm a nonprofit student at the New School with a focus of food policy, food justice. Now, when we're looking at free lunch, it really started with the Black Panthers back in the 60s. And that was not to go into the schools, it was community-based. So I love that it came up before I asked the questions, partners. And really partnering up with maybe community organizations. Maybe some of that can be deflected with that and working with schools so it doesn't overwhelm schools that have to come up with everything. Is that something that a study has been done? I'm sure people have looked into it, but what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know about any studies, but I do know that a lot of schools partner with food-based community organizations to provide, this is coming back to extra food, so they'll have a food pantry in the school, or they'll have a backpack program that they send kids home with food over the weekend, and so very often that's donated through community groups and brought into the schools, and that seems to have, anecdotally, a big effect on families feeling cared for in the schools, as well as I don't know on academics, but certainly it also, I think, can lead to more students coming to school, say on a Friday, if they know that they're getting a backpack, so they're more likely to show up to get the food, to bring it home to the family. So that's one way that I know of that community organizations have worked with schools to support and feed students.
But the thing with food pantries is we're always assuming that people cook.
Right.
So even though that's a great idea, most people aren't. We don't know their living situations, we don't know their schedules. So having that community base where maybe they're cooking and it's like an everyday thing, maybe the evening or weekend, something that's tied to the schools who can do the data to see if that has worked, that is associated with the school. I think I was kind of going there, maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate not only the question, but the spirit behind the question, and I can't speak to any studies being done, but I can just speak personally that in our experience working with a few nonprofits, now we're working with an organization called Teens for Food Justice, who helped us build this hydroponic farm. So again, we're growing food, really it's closer to $30 per month for seeds, and then the three big nutrients, phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen, that circulate throughout the day in our hydro farm. We're growing 15,000 pounds per year. Now, I don't know, we haven't done the calculations, how much money that saves the Department of Ed, but we literally built this thing in a storage closet. I met with a school last week in the Bronx who wants to replicate it. I mean, this is something that could be in every school. So I don't want to necessarily promote hydroponics in every school, but that came out of a partnership, an organization that's committed to bringing high quality, nutrient-dense food to communities that sometimes, they just don't have access. They live in food deserts. And we all know this, that, high quality food is not always accessible to folks that are living in low socioeconomic communities, which is really unfortunate. But if we work with organizations and then take more responsibility within the school, and I think, the point earlier about schools resist that. I think that, schools need to embrace the fact that, we are responsible for a lot, and that these are partnerships that are meaningful, and that I wouldn't, me personally as a principal wouldn't want to just put it on the bureaucracy and the state. So I think those partnerships are valuable, and I think, I really appreciate what you were saying about the Panthers and the work they did, to bring the community into the school.
Just one question on top of that. Going back slightly, who do you think should be driving this? Should it be parents? Should it be principals? Should it be researchers? Don't say all. Who should be the primary driver of this? Do you think it could be students driving that food, and good quality nutrition are critical for their education?
I don't know if kids can drive it. I think they need to be
Parents?
part of it. I think, for us, we have, our students essentially are managing the farm at this point. I mean, we've passed it along to them. But I think that leaders in positions of power where they can affect change, principals, superintendents, I mean, we have a city that has a chancellor, I guess other districts have superintendents. I mean, they need to drive this, but it needs to be part of the equation, and this is my point earlier.
But what moves them? What's gonna move, I mean, you know the system better than most people that I know. What will move the superintendent? What will move the chancellor? What will move principals to make a change?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, like right now, like, I mean, the comment I made earlier about coronavirus, it's like, we see on one extreme, right, we're in the middle of a crisis, and then in the middle of crisis, people wake up and they realize what schools actually provide and how important that is. The question is, like, from the other side, right, people like you, you know, directing a food policy center, and I don't know how much reach you have, but there really needs to be a shift in conversation, right? Like, we've gone so far to one extreme, right, testing culture. We've become a culture that focuses on one thing, and that one thing is the test. And we need to change that narrative, that conversation. You're asking a big question, and I think...
And instinctively, you have an opinion, and I want to try to drag it out of you.
Yeah, I mean, instinctively, I mean, my opinion is that, like, you know, me personally as a principal and someone who directs other principals, I do feel that principals can do a lot in this field. But at the same time, I mean, I'm growing, I mean, it sounds like a lot when I say 15,000 pounds. We serve 2,000 students on the Martin Luther King campus, right? There's a lot I've been able to do, but I don't control purchasing. You know, like when school districts purchase pink slime and they feed, you know, kids this crap, like, you know, I mean, who's making that decision? Who decided to purchase, like, the lowest quality of beef and then, like, turn it into some, like, gooey pink substance and then feed it to children? Like, who made that decision, right?
Yeah, I don't think that's fair. You know, I wanted to say two things about this. One of the things we haven't spoken at all about is the open campus policy. So we ask who would support it. Where does this come from? One of the questions is about open campuses. Lots of kids don't, open campus, does that phrase mean something to all of you? It means the kids can go out to lunch. You know, do we think that what they're doing, I mean, what do they want? A lot of kids, especially high school
the older kids, yeah, the high school students. And
I think it's middle school and above. I think it starts someplace
grade.
around,
Starts in fifth grade, they get to
grade.
go out once a week or something like that, and, yeah.
Yeah, but we actually know little about that. I think the Office of School Food has been trying to get get data together on it. We tried to do a survey once a few years back. It was hard to do, but do we think that that's what's better? What if they're going out and buying, from a street vendor? Do we think that's better? I don't think. I think there are some sort of school-based policies we could change. And I do think would be worth, I don't think that the school lunch is as bad as all that. And the folks who are ordering and doing this thing, I think are trying. And it's bad we didn't bring somebody here. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that going back to your question a little bit, I think that we haven't really talked about what they're actually eating when they're being served this food, and going back to the importance of nutrition education from the very beginning and incorporating parents, and like we were talking about cooking skills, that's a huge thing. I think in New York City, I mean, I grew up in suburbs, so I didn't have the opportunity to stop at a food truck or, a convenience store, and I've seen multiple people come to the School of Global Public Health talking about doing studies where they're asking kids how much are they spending. They have $1 in their pocket, what are they going in and buying? They're not picking up an apple, they're picking up a candy bar and chips, a soda, etc. And then also think about the open campus thing of where they're getting their food and what food choices they're making and their understanding of how well the nutritional quality of their diet affects their overall health, and what parents end up doing even outside after what the school does. I think there's a lot of issues here that, and it's hard to put the blame on anybody, I guess.
Yeah, I don't think it's being blamed, we're just trying to talk about how, I don't think it's blame, it's just talking about priorities.
Blame, but trying to incorporate, how much do we incorporate parents into helping, or single, a lot of parents, they're single mothers, people who are busy,
Right, but I think going back to what Kevin had said, and it's not just because I know him and like him, it's also because it was something that was so apparent to, Alexina, the deputy director, myself, the New York Times article that came out, and every single speech is about how we can't close the schools because we have to feed the kids. So sorry, you have a question.
Thank you all for your time and your expertise. I work K-12 setting, teaching what I deem as food literacy, and in low-income, high-income communities, I have students that tell me some days I'm literally just running on fumes, is what they've told me. They'll skip breakfast, not eat lunch because the school lunch is not good regardless of the area that the school is in, and then some days they don't eat breakfast. And then in some schools they have those like the food pantry bags and such, but I'll come into school in the afternoons because I teach an after school setting, and those bags will just be there. Kids won't take them. So I'm just wondering, how do we address that stigma around food insecurity, whether in a high school, middle school, or even a higher academic level, where no one wants to be seen as the hungry individual, even though that's, you know, negatively impacting them on so many levels.
Can I add to that? I also work for a non-for-profit, and we do after-school programming with families and kids. We teach cooking, and we go to different countries, and I have the same problem where these poor kids come and they haven't eaten anything. They literally will show, they'll keep the hot dog or whatever they brought, and it's frozen. And it's, how can we change that? Because it's not fair to them, and then they're coming to this after-school programming once a week, and then they're eating because that's their dinner. And it's like, it's very sad, but there has to be something, like, who can we report? Like, I wanted to report to someone, but who do I go to? Because it's not fair to them.
Well, I would just jump in and say, at least in terms of stigma issues, I think that the universal free meals does a lot to reduce that. And even just having keypads for where you enter your numbers where students don't necessarily know if they're getting free or reduced or just paying out of pocket, I think helps. But definitely having the universal free lunch and free breakfast is a great step toward that. I don't know that it does everything, and I think you're getting a little bit at the quality too, that some students aren't going to eat it because it just doesn't taste good. That's a different problem that I think you have to come at a different way, but I do think that the universal free meals does a lot to address the stigma.
Yeah, I think that is why these studies of universal free meals have been shown to be affecting both the poor kids who would have been eligible even without that, and non-poor kids, right? So it's both group of kids, the ones who have been eligible, because the ones who had been eligible were reluctant to participate. And now when everybody is, and you don't have to out yourself, participation's up.
Okay, I've just told to be short, so I'll talk fast. I'm a former New York City public school principal, and now we're a nonprofit that works nationally with school lunch. And I first just wanted to ask if we can get the links to two of those studies, the Universal Free Lunch on Academics and the Water Jets on Obesity. If we can get links to those. But
Yeah, online.
thank you.
I mean, they're published, yeah.
We'll get them for you, and we actually created a resource guide, and we'll add them if they're not already there. And
Awesome.
we're publishing that this week, so we had an extensive 50-hour, guide.
Thank you.
So.
And I actually just have a comment that might answer, it's my answer to your question, and that is there's amazing work around this country, not just in New York City, and there are food service directors who are incredibly progressive, doing work that is, I want to say, above the USDA standards. So my comment is, who is responsible? And I know it sounds like a really huge beast, but until the USDA standards change, children can eat a frozen processed pizza, a cup of juice, and a chocolate milk, and that is their lunch. And that satisfies the USDA regulations. So those standards really need to be higher. We just did an assessment in a city, not this city, where for 3 days in a row, 80% of the children ate exactly that. The juice satisfied their fruit requirement, the milk, the chocolate milk, their milk requirement, and then the grain and protein with the processed pizza. And that is happening. Those are our standards. And my organization is called Wellness in the Schools. Wellness in the Schools.
One more question.
Well, first of all, thank you for the wonderful talk and the thought points that I hope to take away from this. Kevin, actually, to address something that you mentioned earlier about what type of discussion do you have as a school administrator and who makes the decision for who's serving that pink gooey brand of slime. The idea of the structural incentives set in place by the New York State Department of Education for the National School Lunch Program, or the Department of Health for the Child and Adult Care Food Program, which incentivizes or has a procurement rule around lowest price wins. Do you feel that, and I would also, try to involve Amy in this question, do you feel that incentivizes the market to provide the worst quality product at a viable financial point for them, because the government has essentially just stated their, what their interest in this matter is, which is to save money at all costs possible?
Would you like to go first? Amy? So we used two words earlier, one fairness and the other blame. And I think it's terribly insufficient to, and weak for us to walk away from our own maybe proclivity to be decent and not blame. And I think there's a lot of blame to go around, and we need to blame people. And I think, Michelle Obama did a lot, and we had the, as First Lady, and we were on the right track, and a lot of what she did has been undone. So absolutely, right, on the ground, I can tell you what it's like on the ground, and it goes back to this other gentleman's question earlier, that kids are walking in, and they'll eat tater tots and pizza, and then they get tired of it. So it's just like, and yes, they're getting the calories, but over time, they just, they may not want those tater tots and pizza, which is pretty much on the menu every day. And then they stop eating, and then they're running on fumes. But then, it's interesting, I did this private school tour a few years ago. Ooh, you walk into a private school, every private school you walk into, they want to show you the cafeteria. Every single one. They want to bring you to the cafeteria. We have organic turkey, we have organic chicken, we have these wonderful salads. And then we come back to the city, and it's well, let's not blame anyone, right? You're absolutely, yes, of course you're absolutely correct. Of course that, they're bidding on contracts, and the cheapest, lowest quality food wins. That's what we feed our kids. And we allow, those in power to say, well, we're being cost effective, and that's we just assume in this paradigm it's the right thing to do. Great, right? And then we have another world of kids who are getting the highest quality food, and I've seen it again and again and again. But it takes me back to the story I told earlier about the water fountain. Really, it's fair, it's great. Let's all go to a New York City public school right now and have lunch. And then we can talk about how fair and how, there's no one to blame. Let's eat the food together. Let's eat that food, and let's see how we feel after a week. There's that documentary, Super Size Me. Let's eat this food for the next 2 months, and let's see how we feel. We can document it and see how we all feel, and then report back. And I guess there's your study. Let's all eat. Charles, you can come into Martin Luther King. I will feed you for the next month. We'll document everything.
I'll probably lose 10 pounds.
And you can bring your wipes in and your Purell and all that, and we'll keep you safe, and we'll see how you feel in a month.
It turns out that we did this big study, big NIH-funded study about what happened about school lunch, and we in fact did qualitative work and sent a bunch of people into the different cafeterias, and probably a couple of dozen, I forgot, it's been a few years. And what they all came back and said is, something? I had this idea that it was going to be horrible, and it really isn't. And so I do think that the narrative of oh, it's awful it's funny and it's appealing, but I do, and the thing is, I don't want to eat what 10-year-olds eat anywhere, pretty much. But I do think it would be important, and I don't think overstating it is helpful. I do know the people who make these decisions, and I don't experience them as getting the lowest possible, the worst thing at the lowest, possible price, no matter how crappy it is. Now, maybe I'm naive, but I don't think so. And I think people are definitely trying. Now, the other thing I think we just have to say is we shouldn't imagine that one option is the kids eat, steamed vegetables and grilled chicken breast, and the other option is they're eating sludge. As kids get older, they're not gonna the alternative to either one has a lot to do with what the kids want to eat. The kids are going to go out there, and if it's too groovy, like they don't want to eat my lunch, then they'll eat other things.
And I will say, I think with greater demand, because at NYU, I am a member of the meal plan. So I go to the dorm rooms all the time, or the cafeterias. And I will say that I've done this for the past 5 years. And there's been a greater push to have more plant-based things. And I know NYU is not paying extra, so I've been told that the vendors changed some of what they were offering to make it more appealing to what NYU kind of wanted. And so I will say that I think as we create greater demand for these things and express an interest in having more of these options, because I remember starting out the first year where we had cheesesteak, macaroni and cheese, and those types of foods. And now all of a sudden, all I can get is white fish and grain bowls and things this year. So, and I think that's great. And so I think it's also been a push and a demand of trying to get healthier.
So I'm sorry though, this is a great discussion, and thank you all for coming. And I want to thank our panelists for coming. They did a great job, and I appreciate everybody coming here today and under the circumstances. And please make sure to check out nycfoodpolicy.org. We have weekly articles there. We have thousands of different articles that are free, and we send out an incredible news digest every week, and certainly worth reading. We have more than 12,000 subscribers, and we have almost 300,000 people that read our website every year. So thank you all, and thank you for a wonderful, let's give them a round of applause for that interesting and fascinating talk. I know we didn't solve all the world's problems today, but we'll try next time.